The Widow's Auction. The dust hadn't settled from the morning's wind when Evangeline Hartwell stepped down from her polished carriage, her pearl necklace catching the harsh Arizona sun like droplets of captured moonlight. The town of Copper Creek had seen its share of fancy folks come and go, but none quite like Mrs. Hartwell, widow of the late railroad magnate Theodore Hartwell, whose fortune had built half the settlements between Phoenix and Tucson. She wore black silk that whispered with each step, a stark contrast to the weathered faces and dusty boots of the townsfolk who had gathered for the monthly livestock auction. Her gloved hands adjusted the string of pearls at her throat as she surveyed the scene before her, cattle lowing in makeshift pens, horses stamping their hooves in the corrals, and men in worn hats conducting business with handshakes and spat tobacco. Sheriff Dawson tipped his hat, his weathered face creasing into what passed for a welcoming smile. "Didn't expect to see you at our little gathering today." Evangeline's blue eyes swept across the auction grounds with the calculating gaze of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. "I have business here, Sheriff. I'm looking to purchase some stock for my late husband's ranch." The ranch, 20,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched from the foothills to the river, now hers by inheritance and legal right. Theodore had left her well provided for, but the ranch hands and foremen had made it clear they didn't much fancy taking orders from a woman, even one who signed their paychecks. "Well, you've come to the right place," Dawson said, gesturing toward the corral. "Got some fine horses up for bid today. That black stallion there belongs to Jake Morrison, lost his spread to the bank last month. Shame, really. That horse has bloodlines going back to Kentucky." Evangeline followed his gaze to where a magnificent black stallion paced restlessly in the wooden pen, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian. But it wasn't the horse that caught her attention, it was the man standing silently beside the corral, one boot propped on the bottom rail, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was tall and lean, with the quiet stillness that marked him as a man comfortable with solitude. His clothes were clean but well worn, faded denim, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and boots that spoke of long hours in the saddle. Unlike the other men who clustered in groups talking and laughing, he stood alone, watching the horses with an intensity that suggested he understood them in ways most folks never would. "Who's that?" Evangeline asked, nodding toward the silent figure. Sheriff Dawson glanced over and chuckled. "That's Daniel Cross, goes by Dan. Been working the Morrison spread for nigh on 5 years now. Good hand, they say, though he ain't much for conversation. Word is he'll be looking for work after today, seeing as Morrison's got nothing left to pay him with." The auctioneer's voice boomed across the grounds, calling the crowd to order. Evangeline made her way closer to the action, acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments that followed in her wake. She was used to being the center of attention. Theodore's social standing had guaranteed that, but this felt different. Here she was an outsider, a city woman playing at ranch life. The bidding began with cattle, and Evangeline found herself studying the crowd more than the livestock. These were hard people shaped by an unforgiving land, their faces carved by sun and wind, their hands calloused from honest work. They eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, unsure what to make of a wealthy widow who had apparently decided to dabble in their world. When the horses came up for auction, the energy in the crowd shifted. Evangeline could feel the tension, the careful attention paid to bloodlines and confirmation. These men knew horseflesh, the way she knew fine art and social graces. The black stallion was among the last to be offered. As he was led into the ring, his head high and eyes flashing with barely contained spirit, a murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. "This here's Thunder," the auctioneer announced. 5 years old, broke but spirited, good mountain horse, sure-footed as they come. "We'll start the bidding at $50. Hands shot up around the ring and the price climbed quickly. 75, 100, 120. Evangeline watched the bidding with growing fascination, noting how the serious contenders held back while others drove the price up with eager, desperate bids. At $150, only 3 bidders remained: a grizzled rancher from the North Valley, a horse dealer from Tucson, and to everyone's surprise, Evangeline herself. She had raised her gloved hand almost without thinking, caught up in the electricity of the moment. The crowd turned to stare, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her hand steady and her gaze fixed on the magnificent animal before her. 160, called the horse dealer. 170, countered the rancher. All eyes turned to Evangeline. The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended, waiting. She could hear her heartbeat in the sudden silence, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides. These people expected her to fold, to retreat back to the safety of her carriage, and her comfortable, predictable world. Instead, she lifted her chin and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the grounds. $200. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. The horse dealer shook his head and stepped back. The rancher studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, then slowly lowered his hand. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Thunder goes to the lady for $200. As the crowd began to disperse, Evangeline made her way toward the horse pens, her heart still racing from the unexpected thrill of the auction. She had acted on impulse, something Theodore would have found both charming and foolish. But now she faced the practical reality of her purchase. She knew how to ride, of course, but her experience was limited to gentle mares and well-trained geldings, suitable for leisurely afternoon rides through Central Park. Thunder was something else entirely. The voice was quiet, respectful, with the subtle drawl that marked him as a man born to this land. Evangeline turned to find Daniel Cross standing a few feet away, his hat in his hand. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his dark eyes, the small scar that ran along his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead despite his attempts to smooth it back. Yes? Begging your pardon, but that's a lot of horse for... He paused, clearly searching for diplomatic words. For a woman? Evangeline's voice carried an edge of challenge. Dan's eyes met hers steadily. For anyone who hasn't worked with his kind before, Thunder's got spirit, sure enough, but he's also got trust issues. Takes a particular touch to bring out the best in him. There was no condescension in his tone, no masculine superiority, just honest assessment delivered with quiet authority. Evangeline found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes, the calm confidence in his manner. I suppose you have that particular touch, she asked. A ghost of a smile flickered across his features. I've had some success with difficult horses, yes ma'am, and I suppose you're looking for work, now that Mr. Morrison has lost his ranch. The smile faded. That's true enough. Evangeline made a decision that would have shocked her husband, scandalized her social circle, and delighted her rebellious younger self. Would you consider working for me, Mr. Cross? At the Hartwell Ranch. Dan replaced his hat, settling it carefully on his head while he considered her offer. Around them the auction was winding down, men settling their accounts and preparing to drive their purchases home. What exactly did you have in mind, ma'am? I need someone who knows horses, someone who can train Thunder here and help me build a proper string for the ranch. The other hand, she hesitated, unwilling to admit how thoroughly they had dismissed her authority. The other hands don't much like taking orders from a woman, Dan finished quietly. Heat flashed in Evangeline's cheeks. You're very direct, Mr. Cross. Yes, ma'am. I find it saves time in the long run. Despite herself, Evangeline smiled. I appreciate directness. It's in short supply in my usual circles. She studied his face, looking for some sign of judgment or mockery, but found only patient attention. Will you work for me? What are you offering for wages? She named a figure that made his eyebrows rise slightly more than generous by local standards, enough to suggest she was either very wealthy or very desperate. Perhaps both. That's fair, he said finally, but I have conditions, such as, I work the horses my way, no interference, and if any of the other hands give me grief about working for you, I handle it my way too. There was something in his tone that suggested his methods might be more direct than diplomatic. Evangeline found the prospect oddly thrilling. They shook hands, her small gloved fingers engulfed by his work-hardened palm, and she felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. Awareness, perhaps, or possibility. When do you want me to start? Dan asked. Tomorrow, if that suits you. I'll have the foreman, Miguel Santos, show you around and get you settled. I know Miguel. Good man. Dan touched the brim of his hat. I'll be there at dawn, Mrs. Hartwell. As he walked away, leading Thunder toward a trailer borrowed for the occasion, Evangeline found herself watching the easy grace of his movements, the quiet authority in the way he handled the spirited horse. For the first time since Theodore's death 6 months ago, she felt something other than grief and uncertainty. She felt anticipation. The ride back to the ranch gave her time to consider what she had done. Hiring Dan Cross was practical. She needed someone who understood horses, and his reputation while quiet was solid. But she couldn't quite convince herself that practicality was her only motivation. There had been something in his eyes, a depth that suggested layers beneath the quiet exterior. He had looked at her not as Theodore's widow, or as a wealthy woman slumming in the West, but simply as a person. It had been refreshing and oddly unsettling. The Hartwell Ranch sprawled across a valley bracketed by red rock formations and rolling hills dotted with pinon and oak. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure that Theodore had built to impress visiting investors and dignitaries from back east. It was beautiful and imposing and utterly impractical for a working ranch, but it had been Theodore's dream and Evangeline had learned to call it home. Miguel Santos met her at the front door, his weathered face creased with concern. "Senora Hartwell, how did the auction go?" "Quite well, Miguel. I purchased a horse, and I hired someone to work with the stock." She handed her gloves to Maria the housekeeper and began unpinning her hat. "Daniel Cross will be starting tomorrow. Please see that he has proper quarters and introduce him to the other hands." Miguel's eyebrows climbed toward his graying hairline. "Dan Cross, see, I know him. Good worker, quiet man. But Senora, the others, they may not what, Miguel?" The foreman shifted uncomfortably. "They may not like taking orders from him. He is not, how do you say, social with the other cowboys." Evangeline paused in her hat removal, studying Miguel's diplomatic expression. "Are you trying to tell me that Mr. Cross is difficult to work with?" "No, Senora, but he is different. He keeps to himself, does not drink with the others, does not talk much. Some of the men, they think he believes himself better than them." "And what do you think, Miguel?" The older man considered carefully. "I think he is a man who knows his business and does his work well. What more do we need?" Evangeline smiled. "My thoughts exactly." The next morning she woke before dawn and dressed in riding clothes, a practical split skirt and boots that Theodore had considered scandalously masculine but which she had grown to prefer for ranch work. She made her way to the kitchen, where Maria was already preparing breakfast for the hands. "Buenos dias, Senora. You are up very early. I want to see Thunder settled in properly," Evangeline explained, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. Through the kitchen window, she could see activity in the corral area. Dan Cross was already there, she noted with approval, working with Thunder in the round pen. Even from a distance, she could see the horse's attention focused completely on the man, responding to subtle cues she couldn't detect. She finished her coffee and made her way outside, where the morning air carried the scents of hay and horses, and the lingering coolness of desert night. The other hands were beginning their daily routines, some shooting curious glances toward the round pen where Dan worked. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell." Tom Bradley, one of the senior hands, touched his hat respectfully, but she caught the slight smirk on his face as he glanced toward the round pen. "Heard you hired Morrison's man." "That's right. Interesting choice." There was something in Bradley's tone that made Evangeline's spine stiffen. "Meaning?" Bradley shrugged, affecting casual indifference. "Just surprised is all. Dan Cross ain't exactly the friendliest sort. Keeps to himself, doesn't socialize with the crew. Some folks might wonder if he thinks he's too good for regular ranch work. Mr. Cross comes with excellent recommendations for his skill with horses," Evangeline said coolly. "That's what matters to me." "Sure enough, ma'am. Just thought you should know what you're getting into." As Bradley walked away, Evangeline felt a flicker of unease. She had hired Dan based on impulse and impression, without checking references or investigating his background beyond Sheriff Dawson's casual assessment. Had she made a mistake? Her doubts evaporated as she approached the round pen, and got her first clear look at Dan working with Thunder. The big stallion, who had been high-strung and unpredictable at the auction, was moving in smooth circles around the pen, his attention fixed completely on the man at the center. Dan held a long rope casually in one hand, but Evangeline could see that the horse was responding to something far more subtle than physical cues. "He's beautiful," she said softly, as Dan brought Thunder to a halt and approached the fence where she stood. "Yes, ma'am, he got a good mind too once you get past his trust issues." Dan's hand moved gently along Thunder's neck, and the horse leaned into the touch. "Somebody worked him hard and not always fair, but he's willing to learn." "How can you tell?" Dan considered the question seriously. "Lots of ways. How he holds his ears, the way he moves, whether he's looking for a way out, or looking to you for direction. Thunder here, he's testing me, seeing if I'm worth his trust. But he's not trying to hurt me,
and he's not shutting down. That tells me he's got heart left. As if to prove the point, Thunder stretched his neck toward Evangeline, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. She held perfectly still, remembering childhood lessons about letting horses make the first move. Go ahead, Dan said quietly. Let him get to know you. Evangeline extended her hand slowly, palm up, and felt the velvet brush of Thunder's muzzle against her fingers. The horse's breath was warm and sweet, and when she moved her hand up to stroke his neck, he didn't pull away. He likes you, Dan observed. How do you know? He's not tense, and his eyes are soft. If he was uncomfortable, you'd see the whites of his eyes, and his muscles would be tight, ready to move away. Standing so close to both man and horse, Evangeline was acutely aware of Dan's presence, the quiet confidence in his movements, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to Thunder, the way he seemed completely at ease in his own skin. There was something deeply attractive about a man who knew his craft so thoroughly. Mrs. Hartwell, Miguel's voice interrupted her thoughts. There is a problem with the fence in the south pasture. The hens are asking what you want them to do. Evangeline sighed, the peaceful moment broken by the endless demands of ranch management. I'll be right there. As she turned to go, Dan's voice stopped her. Ma'am, if you'd like, I could work with Thunder in the afternoons, after the morning chores are done. Might be something you'd enjoy watching. There was nothing improper in the suggestion, but something in his tone made her pulse quicken. I think I'd like that very much, Mr. Cross. Over the following weeks, those afternoon training sessions became the highlight of Evangeline's day. She would bring a book or needlework to the fence rail, and settle in to watch Dan work his quiet magic with Thunder and the other horses that had been brought in for training. At first she genuinely tried to read or sew, but she found herself increasingly absorbed in the subtle communication between man and horse. Dan never raised his voice, never forced an issue, but somehow managed to shape the animal's behavior through patience, consistency, and an almost supernatural understanding of equine psychology. How did you learn to work with horses like that? She asked one afternoon as Dan led a young gelding through its paces. Started when I was a kid, Dan replied, not taking his eyes off the horse. My father had a way with animals, and he taught me that force just creates fear and resistance. Better to make them want to work with you. Your father was a horseman. Dan's expression grew distant. Among other things, he died when I was 14, and I've been making my own way since then. There was pain in his voice, old and carefully controlled, and Evangeline found herself wanting to know more. But she had learned to recognize when Dan was willing to talk, and when he preferred silence, so she let the subject drop. As Thunder's training progressed, so did the tension among the ranch hands. It started with small things, tools left in the wrong places, subtle exclusion from conversations, the kind of petty harassment that could make a man's life miserable without crossing any clear lines. Dan handled it with the same quiet patience he showed the horses, but Evangeline could see the strain in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he moved through the bunkhouse area. The other hands seemed determined to prove that he didn't belong, and their resentment was beginning to affect the overall atmosphere on the ranch. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning, when Evangeline arrived at the corrals to find Thunder pacing restlessly in his stall, clearly agitated. Dan was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual. He was always there before dawn, checking on the horses, and planning the day's work. Miguel, where's Mr. Cross? She asked when the foreman appeared with the morning work assignments. Miguel's face was grim. There was an incident last night, Senora. Some of the hands, they had been drinking, and there were words exchanged. What kind of words? The kind that lead to fighting, I'm afraid. Tom Bradley, he challenged Dan's right to give orders about the horses, said maybe it was time to find out if the quiet man could back up his opinions with his fists. Evangeline felt ice form in her stomach, and Dan tried to walk away, but Bradley pushed him.
Called him a coward. Said he was probably afraid to fight, like a real man. Miguel shook his head. That was a mistake. Where is Mr. Cross now? In his room, nursing split knuckles and a black eye. Bradley is in town seeing the doctor about his broken nose. Evangeline found Dan sitting on the edge of his narrow bunk, gingerly exploring a spectacular bruise that covered half his face. His right hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth, and there were scratches on his arms that suggested the fight had been brief but violent. Mr. Cross, she knocked gently on the doorframe. May I come in? He looked up, and she saw embarrassment flicker in his dark eyes. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about last night. I tried to avoid trouble, but Mr. Bradley wouldn't let you." Evangeline stepped into the small room, noting its sparse but scrupulously clean condition. "Miguel told me what happened. I'll be ready to work in an hour or so," Dan said, starting to rise. "Thunder needs—" "Mr. Cross, sit down." The authority in her voice surprised them both. "You're hurt, and the horses can wait one morning." She moved closer, studying the damage to his face with concern. "That looks painful. I've had worse." "I'm sure you have." She reached out instinctively to touch the bruised skin, then caught herself and pulled her hand back. "I'm sorry this happened. I should have dealt with the situation before it got to this point." Dan's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise there. "Ma'am, this wasn't your fault. Bradley's been spoiling for a fight since I got here. Last night just gave him the excuse he was looking for." "Will there be more trouble?" "Not from Bradley." There was quiet certainty in Dan's voice. "But I can't say about the others. Some of them, they see me as an outsider you brought in to lord over them. Others just don't like change." Evangeline sat down on the single chair in the room, suddenly feeling the weight of all her decisions since Theodore's death. "Maybe I made a mistake, hiring you. I wanted someone who could handle the horses, but I didn't think about how it would affect the rest of the crew. Do you regret it?" The question was asked quietly, without accusation, but Evangeline heard something vulnerable beneath Dan's calm exterior. She looked at him, really looked, taking in the patient intelligence in his eyes, the strength in his work-hardened hands, the way he held himself with unconscious dignity despite his battered condition. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it at all." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that went beyond employer and employee, beyond the careful boundaries they had maintained. Evangeline felt her heart begin to race, felt the pull of attraction she had been trying to ignore for weeks. "Miss Hartwell," Dan said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her name sound like a caress. "Evangeline," she whispered, and then throwing caution to the wind, "My name is Evangeline." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. "Evangeline," he repeated, and the sound sent shivers down her spine. They might have kissed then. She could see the desire in his eyes, could feel her own body leaning toward his, but footsteps in the corridor outside broke the spell. Dan's hand dropped to his side, and they both sat back, the moment lost but not forgotten. "I should check on Thunder," Dan said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Evangeline agreed, though what she wanted was to stay in this small room and explore the feelings that had been building between them for weeks. "Yes, of course." But as she left the bunkhouse and walked back toward the main house, she couldn't stop thinking about the warmth in Dan's eyes when he had spoken her name, or the gentle strength in his touch. For the first time since Theodore's death, she felt truly alive. The confrontation with Bradley had an unexpected result. Instead of driving Dan away, it seemed to earn him a grudging respect from some of the other hand. Word spread quickly through the small community about how the quiet horse trainer had handled himself against the ranch's acknowledged tough guy, and the consensus seemed to be that anyone who could drop Tom Bradley with 3 quick punches was not a man to be taken lightly. The harassment didn't stop entirely, but it became more subtle, and Dan's position on the ranch grew more secure. He continued working with Thunder and the other horses, and his afternoon training sessions with Evangeline became an established routine that no one questioned, at least not openly. As autumn deepened into winter, Thunder's transformation became apparent to everyone on the ranch. The high-strung, unpredictable stallion had developed into a responsive, intelligent mount who seemed to anticipate his rider's wish. Dan began suggesting that Evangeline try riding him, and after some initial nervousness, she discovered that Thunder was as gentle with her as he was spirited under Dan's guidance. "He knows you're not a threat," Dan explained as they walked the horses back to the corral after a successful afternoon ride. "Horses can sense fear, but they can also sense confidence and kindness. Thunder trusts you because you've been patient with him." "I had a good teacher," Evangeline said, and was rewarded with one of Dan's rare smiles. Their relationship had deepened into something that was part friendship, part professional partnership,
and part something else that neither of them was quite ready to name. They talked easily now about horses and ranch work, and occasionally about their pasts, though both had subjects they preferred to avoid. Evangeline had learned that Dan had spent most of his adult life drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He was a man shaped by solitude, comfortable with his own company but somehow lonely in ways he probably didn't even recognize. Dan, for his part, had begun to understand that beneath Evangeline's polished exterior was a woman hungry for authenticity, for connection to something real and meaningful. Her marriage to Theodore had been successful by society's standards. He had been a good provider and a faithful husband, but it had also been emotionally sterile, built more on mutual benefit than passionate love. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd made different choices? Evangeline asked one December afternoon as they watched thunder play in the snow-dusted corral. Dan considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but wondering doesn't change anything. We are who we are because of the choices we've made, good and bad. I sometimes think I've never made a real choice in my life, Evangeline said quietly. I married Theodore because my parents thought it was a good match. I came west because it was what he wanted. Even hiring you, that was the first time I can remember doing something purely because I wanted to. And do you regret it? She turned to look at him, this quiet man who had somehow become essential to her happiness. No, it was the best decision I ever made. Their eyes met and held, and this time there were no interruptions, no footsteps in the corridor to break the moment. Dan stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face, and Evangeline felt her breath catch. Evangeline, he said softly, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing urgency as she responded. She had been kissed before, of course, but never like this, never with this sense of rightness, of coming home. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Evangeline could see her own wonder reflected in Dan's eyes. I've wanted to do that for months, he admitted. I've wanted you to, she whispered back. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, holding each other, and Evangeline felt as though her life was finally beginning. But their happiness was short-lived. Word of their relationship, discreetly conducted though it was, began to spread through the small community. Evangeline was a wealthy widow, a woman of social standing, and Dan was a hired hand with no family, no property, no prospects beyond his skill with horses. The disparity in their stations was too great for the gossips to ignore. The talk reached its peak when Miss Dorothy Whitman, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of Copper Creek's moral standards, paid a visit to the ranch. Evangeline, dear, she said over tea in the main house's formal parlor, I hope you won't take this amiss, but people are talking. Are they? Evangeline kept her voice level, though her hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. About you and that man Cross, is it? People are saying that that you're becoming too familiar with him. Mr. Cross is an employee of this ranch. Dorothy, I hardly see how my professional relationship with him concerns anyone else. Mrs. Whitman's lips pursed disapprovingly. Professional relationship? My dear, he's a common cowhand, and you're Theodore Hartwell's widow. Your behavior reflects not only on your own reputation but on your late husband's memory. Evangeline felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. My late husband has been dead for over a year, Dorothy. I think I'm entitled to live my own life now. Of course, dear, but surely you can see how inappropriate this is. The man has nothing, no family, no property, no social standing. What could you possibly have in common with someone like that? More than you might think, Evangeline said coldly, after Miss Whitman left, full of thinly veiled threats about what people might say if Evangeline continued her association with Dan. Evangeline found herself pacing the house like a caged animal. She had known this moment would come, had been dreading it even as she allowed herself to fall deeper in love with Dan Cross. The problem wasn't just social disapproval, though that was bad enough in a small community where reputation mattered. The real issue was legal. Theodore's will had left her well provided for, but there were conditions. If she remarried beneath her station, and the will's language was quite specific about what constituted appropriate social standing, she would forfeit most of her inheritance. She had consulted with Theodore's lawyer months ago, hoping to find a loophole, but the language was ironclad. Theodore had loved her, she knew, but he had also been a controlling man who wanted to ensure that his widow wouldn't be taken advantage of by fortune hunters. The irony was bitter. Dan had no idea how wealthy she truly was, and his feelings for her had nothing to do with money. But according to Theodore's definition, a penniless ranch hand was exactly the kind of man she needed to be protected from. That evening she found Dan in the barn, checking on a mare who was due to foal soon. He looked up when she entered, and his smile faded when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" She told him about Miss Whitman's visit, about the gossip, about the legal complications that made their relationship potentially ruinous for both of them. Dan listened without comment, his face growing more closed with each word. "So that's it then," he said when she finished. "I should pack my things and move on." "No." The word came out more forcefully than she intended. "I don't want you to go. Evangeline, I won't be the cause of you losing everything your husband left you, and I won't have people talking about you like you're some kind of scandal. What if I don't care about the money?" Dan's laugh was short and bitter. "Easy to say when you've never been without it. You think you know what poverty looks like because you've seen the hands living in the bunkhouse, but that's not real hardship. I've been hungry, Evangeline. I've slept in barns and under bridges. I've worked for men who treated me like less than their horses. You have no idea what you'd be giving up, and you have no idea what I'd be gaining." She shot back. "Do you think Theodore's money has made me happy? Do you think living in that big house, surrounded by beautiful things I can't share with anyone who matters, is some kind of paradise?" They stared at each other across the width of the barn, both breathing hard, both struggling with the impossible situation they found themselves. "There has to be a way," Evangeline said finally. "What way?" "You marry me, you lose your inheritance. I stay here, people will make your life miserable with their gossip and judgment. Either way we both end up worse off than we started." "Maybe," Evangeline said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "Or maybe we need to change the rules of the game." Over the next few days, Evangeline threw herself into planning with the same intensity she had once brought to Theodore's business entertaining. She researched property laws, consulted with lawyers in Phoenix, and quietly liquidated some of her more portable assets. The plan she developed was risky and unconventional, but it offered a way out of their impossible situation. It would require her to give up the security and social standing she had known all her life, but it would also give her something she had never had: the freedom to choose her own path. On a cold February morning, Evangeline called Dan to the main house. She had been avoiding him for days, and she could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes as he stood awkwardly in the formal parlor. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about the impossibility of our situation." Dan's jaw tightened. And you're right. As long as we stay here, in this place with these expectations, we'll never be free to be together." "Evangeline," she held up a hand to stop him. "I've made a decision. I'm selling the ranch." Dan stared at her in shock. "I'm selling the ranch, liquidating my assets, and starting over somewhere else. Somewhere we can be whoever we choose to be." "You can't do that. This place, it's your home, your security. This place is a prison," Evangeline said firmly. "A beautiful, comfortable prison, but a prison nonetheless. I've spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations, Dan. I want to live according to my own." "Where would we go?" "I've been thinking about California. There are opportunities there for people willing to work hard, and it's far enough away that no one will know or care about our pasts." Dan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the ranch that had become his home. "You'd give up all this for me?" "I'd give up all this for us," Evangeline corrected. Dan crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he reached her, he took her hands in his calloused ones, studying her with the same careful attention he gave to the horses he trained. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Once we leave here, there's no going back. People will talk, call you foolish, say I took advantage of you." "Let them talk," Evangeline said, lifting her chin with characteristic determination. "I'd rather be poor and happy with you than rich and miserable without you." The sale of the ranch proceeded quickly, too quickly for some of the townspeople, who whispered that Mrs. Hartwell had clearly lost her mind. She sold to a cattle consortium from Texas, retaining only enough money to buy a modest spread in California's Central Valley and provide a simple but comfortable start for their new life. On their last morning in Copper Creek, as the sun painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Evangeline stood in the courtyard of the house that had never truly felt like home. She wore a simple traveling dress, practical cotton instead of silk, sturdy boots instead of delicate slippers. Her pearls were packed away in a trunk, replaced by a simple gold band on her left hand. Dan emerged from the barn leading Thunder, now saddled and ready for the long journey ahead. The other horses had been sold with the ranch, but Thunder was different. He was family now, bound to them by trust and affection rather than ownership papers. "Ready?" Dan asked, and there was something new in his voice, a confidence that hadn't been there when he was merely the hired hand. "I've been ready for months," Evangeline replied, accepting his help into the saddle. As they rode out of Copper Creek in the early morning light, he on his steady bay gelding, she on the magnificent black stallion that had brought them together, the townspeople watched from windows and doorway. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others in bewilderment, a few perhaps remembering their own abandoned dreams, watched with something that might have been envy. Mrs. Dorothy Whitman stood on her front porch, her face set in lines of righteous disapproval. "Mark my words," she declared to anyone within hearing, "she'll be back within the year begging for help." But Sheriff Dawson, who had known both hardship and happiness in his long life, tipped his hat as they passed. "Good luck to you both," he called out, and meant. As Copper Creek disappeared behind them and the wide road to California stretched ahead, Evangeline felt something she had never experienced before, the exhilarating terror of complete freedom. She had left behind everything society said she should value: wealth, security, social position, for something far more precious and uncertain. The rich widow had indeed arrived at the auction in Pearl, but she was leaving on the horse of the silent ranch hand, riding toward a future that belonged entirely to them.